Hello everyone, I am Dr. Supriya Mandloi from the Department of English of the Bhopal School of Social Sciences. The topic for today's session is a brief history of Indian English poetry. English education in India was introduced in the year 1830s, or you could say the decades of 1830s, and that was the time when colonization had expanded, and now it was the time also to change the way Indians will be exposed to Western education. Lord Macaulay's Minute on Education speak well about the introduction of English language, and with the introduction of English language, or rather with the spread of colonization, Indians were given a new language to express themselves. Indian English poetry was of a later origin because Indians required this much of time to make themselves proficient, make themselves competent with regards to use of English. However, there were initial experiments, and it was only with the passage of time that the English used by the Indian poets and writers became more sound, became more similar to the language used by the native. Definitely the thoughts will not be similar, because when a poet or a writer communicates in English or any language, the subconsciousness of the poet and the writer relates with the cultural and linguistic setting of the nation of which he is a native speaker. The poetry written with regards to Indian English covers three phases of existence. The three phases are the imitative, the assimilative, and the experimental. The poetry written by Indian in English in the last 150 years has been divided into these three phases, and as the title of different phases indicate, the poetry and the poets experienced a change with the successive decades and years to come. For example, in the initial years, the Indian poets were inspired more by their Western counterparts. They tried to imitate the Western counterparts, and somewhere the thematic concerns were also similar to what was used by the Europeans, especially the Britishers outside India. Let us look at each of these phases individually. The imitative phase. The period of the imitative phase is 1850 to 1900. We also notice here that the first war of Indian independence was fought in the year 1857. These are also the decades when we have the Bengal Renaissance. We have thinkers like Raja Ram Mohan Roy, Henry Vivian Desrosiers. We have also the emergence of very important political parties. We have the setting up of Indian National Congress, the Theosophical Society of India. So somewhere a change in learning and thoughts is happening in India. Indian poets during this period are primarily romantic in nature, because across the borders their Western counterparts were strongly influenced by the romantic movement, especially which was prominent in England and France. The Indian poets, because of they being romantic by temperament and absorbing the romantic movement in England, have often been derogatorily remarked as romantics in Indian garb. There is a remark by George Bottomley, who pointed out that the poetry of India, or the Indian English poetry written by Indian poets, is almost like Matthew Arnold in a sari, or as some others have remarked, Shakuntala in a mini skirt. Now, if you look at the derogatory usage here, it implies that the poets were Indian at heart, and while their expression was European in nature. We do agree that this is a derogative remark, and it does comment strongly with regards to the Indian English poetry. The inspiration for the Indian English poets were the British Romantic poets, especially William Wordsworth, John Keats, Lord Byron, and P.B. Shelley. The major poets who wrote during the imitative phase were Toru Dutt, Michael Madhusudan Dutt, and Henry Louis Vivian Desrosiers, of whom Henry Louis Vivian Desrosiers was a Portuguese. So he was part Indian by birth. However, he had strong Indian sentiments and wrote strongly in favor of the political liberation of India, and tried to express his radical views with regard to liberation and free thinking. Toru Dutt also was a significant poet of this period, and the creative upsurge occasioned by the romantic spirit contributed to the poems and thematic concerns. Major themes explored by the poets of this period were heritage, that is the national heritage of their country India, as well as a reflection upon the prominent Indian legends. For example, Toru Dutt in her work Lakshman and Sita talks about the ancient legendary figures Sita and Lakshman. In one of her poems, Our Casuarina Tree, she becomes quite nostalgic and has a regret for her lost childhood because she is now based in US. The second phase of Indian English poetry starts from 1900 to 1947. In the world during this period of time, we have two significant world wars. We have the Indian freedom movement emerging strongly as a voice of liberation, and therefore the poets writing this period are assimilating the trend both of romanticism as well as the new romantics of the decadent period. They try to express the consciousness of Indian Renaissance because there was a revival in thinking in India during this period of time. Lot of journals were published, newspapers were coming out. The spirit of Renaissance was in the air, and every other freedom fighter or a revolutionary was a poet at heart, because pen was simultaneously working with sword to liberate India. Between nationalism and political changes which ultimately led to the attainment of political freedom, we find the assimilative phase, and therefore, as the title suggests and as the time duration indicate, this period and the poems written during this period are strongly influenced by themes of nationalism, spirituality and mysticism. The major poets contributing this period were Sarojini Naidu, Rabindranath Tagore, Aurobindo Ghosh and Harindranath Chattopadhyay, to name a few. If you look at Rabindranath Tagore, his name requires no mention. The writer of the poet of our national, the poet who gave us our national anthem, the poet who won the Nobel Prize for Literature for his prominent work Gitanjali, is just an example of how Indian English poetry was evolving. Although Gitanjali was written in Bengali and then we have translations, but then the voice of India was being heard far and wide. Sarojini Naidu also tries to experiment with language. So initially her themes and her poems are strongly inspired by the poetic style of William Wordsworth. However, much later Edmund Gosse advised her to speak about her country, to refer to symbols and images which are drawn from Indian subcontinent rather than to talk about a maple tree or a daffodil. Later we have the post-independence period. During this period, we notice that the political independence has been resolved in 1947. Tensions were suddenly relaxed. Now it is an era of hope and aspiration, which was replaced by an era of questioning, because previous decades the writers and the poets were happy, they were joyful because they had learned a new language. Now with the help of this language, they have started questioning also. National identity gives a new confidence to the Indian poets and writers, and now with the setting up of English schools and frequent use of English language for administrative and official purposes is also strengthening the English used by the Indians. The last phase of Indian English poetry is the experimental phase, which covers the modern and the postmodern period. The process of modernization included urbanization, industrialization, large-scale mobility from rural to urban areas, increased means of communication like films, television, radio, national and international transportation networks, plus the resulting paradox which as an Indian independent culture emerges, because now India is independent. So as a nation, how it develops and creates its identity, some of these aspects now recur in the themes of Indian English poets. So major post-independence Indian English poets were Nizam Ezekiel, Dom Morais, A.K. Ramanujan, R. Parthasarathi, K. N. Daruwala, Jayant Mahapatra and many more. The poems written by these poets is largely experimental. They reflect urban middle class perspective. Themes are majorly open minded, so the people are free to interpret, so there is never a close ending theme of any specific poem. There are experimentation and modernity, which emphasizes roots in Indian culture, as well as language diversity, which gets reflected. So all the regional languages of India are being experimented with terms of composition, and many of these are available in form of translation. Realism, intellectual critique is also one important thematic concern of the experimental phase. Now we notice that the poets of this period focus on precision in thought and expression. They are now using English with its technical precision. They are able to experiment with symbolic usages, literary devices, and they never fail to uphold the culture and regional identity of India.